Hey everyone, welcome to The Final Four is Not on the Schedule. I'm your host Eric, alongside with expert analyst Rod. Thanks for joining us on the best MSU basketball podcast featuring in-depth recruiting, game matchup, and post-game analysis. We dive deep to give you the best tools to enjoy the Spartans and impress your friends and family. Hey everybody, it's Eric alongside Rod here, continuing with our Big Ten previews. I bet you can't guess who is Rod's number 8 team. It's the Iowa Hawkeyes. Thank you to all of you who support us on the show via one-time gifts through PayPal or Venmo, or on a recurring monthly basis on Patreon or Substack. You can head on over to www.thefinalfourisnotontheschedule.com/support if you'd like to assuage your guilt and you're not currently supporting the show. All right, so this has been a very unusual offseason for the Hawkeyes and their little brother, the Cyclones, both in basketball and football. A lot of players are found to be gambling on sports, which the state of Iowa has been cracking down on. In fact, some players have been implicated in gambling on their own teams, not only just in their own sport. And not a lot of other, I guess it's safe to wager that this happens everywhere. But to date, most of the college athletes rounded up have mainly been from the Hawkeye state.
Well, I think that's probably a safe assumption that wagering is going on. Whether it's everywhere that guys are betting on their own teams, I would like to believe that that's not quite as common, but you never know. And what's been interesting about it is, at least to date, and I think I've got this right, definitely when it comes to Iowa, the one guy who's been implicated from Iowa basketball is Aaron Eulis, who coincidentally or not transferred to Nebraska. Now that's not going to help him. He's probably going to have to sit the year out. And Iowa State has had some guys transfer who then later, we've talked about Jeremiah Williams with regard to Rutgers already. Same deal. I want to say Iowa State may have had some guys in non-basketball sports who had not transferred, who have been caught. And Iowa definitely did in baseball, maybe. There were definitely, it was non-basketball sports. Yeah.
And football for sure.
But who knows if it's right. And who knows if it's going to get wider. But this should not be taken, as I think you were alluding to, this should not be taken as an indication that, wow, Iowa's just got a major problem in terms of kids gambling. It's that the state of Iowa has opted to be very aggressive in their enforcement. That's what's going on.
Right.
I don't think we could take it as a sign that everybody else is clean. And this was inevitable. I mean, this is an inevitable function, I think, of two things. One is the ever increasing ease with which people can gamble, period, and on sports in particular. I think that's part of it. And now with college students, particularly those in higher profile sports, you cannot dismiss the idea that NIL money is having an impact here, if for no other reason than it is, income. It's money that kids have in their hands that they wouldn't have necessarily had before, at least not in that amount. And that's not, by the way, I'm not making an argument to say NIL is a bad idea or it should be curtailed or guardrails or any of this other nonsense you hear, but it's a fact. But it would be the same thing for somebody who's making more money as something other than a college student. More disposable income means that you may perceive, if you have an interest in something like gambling or drugs or alcohol or any other pathology, that it may be easier for you to slip into it. Some of these numbers that I've seen, the amount of money that these guys were wagering, maybe not the amount is one thing, but the sheer number of bets that were made by some of these guys that have been implicated at the Iowa schools is mind-boggling.
Yeah.
It suggests, gambling is something that can be fun, obviously, but like other so-called vices, there's a point in which it tips over into being a pathology. And some of those numbers I've seen suggest that at the least, it was a very, very bad habit. for some of these guys. I mean, the number of bets they were making ranged into 4 digits.
Yeah, well, and I think that
in a year is crazy,
and that sort of speaks to the ubiquitousness of the ability to gamble online, especially because you can make, I don't know,
Yep.
I mean, my guess is, and not being a gambler, that 25 years ago there aren't a whole lot of people making $1 bets on 10 different games, but now it's so easy
Correct.
with these apps. You know, you don't have to go to bookie, you know, for $1, but you can do small stakes. For instance, you know, $5 on a bunch of games. And so I think that makes it easier. Also, the anonymity that the online, you know, presence
Yep.
provides. You find someone like I think Aaron Eulis was using his mom's name and identity to gamble.
These guys
right.
have found out that's not
Right.
going to be a sufficient shield to avoid getting caught. And again, that's going to come back in large part to whatever is motivating a particular state's gaming commission to look deeply at this stuff, because that's what went on. And I think a lot of other states are just opting to choose a blind eye, or they have other priorities in terms of their activity, what have you. But it's not happening like this everywhere. But yeah, that's not a sufficient shield. And it's clearly the ease with which it's these ideas you hear in business circles about, frictionless transactions, right?
Yeah.
That's what the digital age is providing us with. Well, that applies to gambling. When you've got major entities that, by the way, advertise in stadia, not just and on television broadcasts like FanDuels and DraftKings.
Mm-hmm.
It's a world apart from. I remember 1991 driving out west to go to law school in San Francisco, driving from Michigan, and we stopped our last night of a 5-day trip. We stayed in Reno, and it was the first time I ever put a legal bet down. I put $20 on a futures bet for the Lions to win the Super Bowl, which was, I think it was 30. I got 35-1 odds. And they actually got to the NFC Championship game.
Oh, that was the year. Oh my gosh, you must have been going crazy.
That was that year. I was in it. But that's the point.
Yeah.
I had to go to Reno.
Right. Yeah.
To make that bet. Now, of course, people had bookies and all these things exist, but that's what they call friction.
Right.
When you have to find a bookie to place an illegal bet, and it's all done in person. All of that stuff acts as a deterrent. It's the same as with anything else. It's the same as if alcohol were outlawed, if we were back in a prohibition environment. It's the same as drugs. Now that marijuana is legal in the state of Michigan, I haven't seen usage statistics, but I'd be surprised if it hasn't gone up.
I can tell you it's gone up.
Because, okay, you might know. But yeah, it would be shocking if it hadn't.
Yeah, I agree.
Because you've still got, you got to actually go to the dispensary. In California, I happen to know you can call it in and have it delivered to you. So that gets closer to true frictionless, but you get my point.
Yeah, sure.
And gambling, it's become that way. And so none of what's gone on in Iowa should be a surprise to anyone. The only thing is, I think other universities have to be praying that their state doesn't get the idea to start turning over rocks, because they'll find things.
Yeah, for sure.
I guarantee you they'd find things at Michigan State. I'd bet the house.
Oh, yeah. No pun intended.
Somewhere.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Somewhere.
Yeah. And not to go down too much the rabbit hole, but just like the point of your frictionless thing, just looking at the economy today, right? Like if you look at spending with a credit card, it's like 16 or 20% higher if you use credit cards versus cash, because that is a deterrent. It's sort of, complicates things. I mean, look at our show. No one's sending us cash, but it's a lot easier for someone to sign up and just do things in a frictionless way through credit cards and stuff. So,
and it's also and this definitely goes along with betting because of the nature of it.
Exactly.
That ease helps turn an impulse into an actual purchase.
Exactly. Yep.
So to speak,
yep. It's like it being in the line at the grocery store and you just pick up that, whether the last minute purchase was you're waiting to check out or something.
Yeah.
All right. So let's talk about basketball, huh? The Iowa Hawkeyes last season were 19-14. They were 11-9 in the Big Ten. They were ranked 41st in KenPom. And it was the second year in a row that they had the loss of a National Player of the Year candidate. This time it was Keegan Murray, and the year before that was Garza. they lost a lot of players, and it looked like they might struggle. Yet Fran McCaffrey was once again able to get them into the NCAA tournament, and he's done pretty well. 7 out of 10 years they've been in the tournament. They haven't done a whole lot when they've gotten there, even when they've had really good teams. And their profile looks very much as it has during his time at Iowa City. So they were 4th nationally in offense, even though they weren't shooting really well. And we've talked about that kind of weird statistical thing, mainly because they just don't turn the ball over. And they're 8th in turnover percentage. And we're a good offensive rebounding team too, so it gives you more opportunities even if you're not shooting well. Defensively,
bottom line,
yeah, right. And so defensively, well, they were bad. They were really bad. They were 168th in KenPom, which is surprisingly actually not the worst they've been under Fran. That's only the 3rd worst. So they were 318th against threes, which is, that's almost as bad as you can get. I think 351 teams. They were 293rd against twos. So, they were a disaster on defense, and that cost them games, just like, but their offensive efficiency would overcome it at times, especially in the conference. And weird things happen, like that game we don't want to think about again. What happened in Iowa City with Michigan State, where they just came back from getting blitzed, and they suddenly came back and won that game. So this is again another year they've lost Chris Murray this time, and they actually lost a couple siblings, and so Chris Murray is the other half of the twins. And so I guess, we could talk about, I guess, last year, but, your impression, I guess, last season in Iowa, and then I guess heading into this year.
Well, I thought it was an accomplishment given how much they'd lost, 2 years running. If you look back to that team 2 years ago, Luka Garza senior year, from which so much was expected, and take it to last season, not much was still on the roster. Between the 2 previous years, they'd pretty much cleared out the significant contributors. And yet Iowa still goes to the NCAA tournament. Mm-hmm. I bag, we bag on Fran McCaffrey on this podcast a lot because he's an easy target. His personality. And if you remember that game against Michigan State, the one you mentioned where they had the huge comeback, before that,
stare down.
There was that segment where they called the timeout. Yeah, and he spent the entire timeout staring at the ref. It was one of the most ludicrous things I've ever seen in a college basketball game. So he's easy to mock for, there's the Fran DEFCON chart, which gets charted out every year. And I love it. I have to admit, every time, I forget which number it is, but I remember that the descriptor reads, Fran is on the move. And it never fails to get a laugh from me when combined with the photo that accompanies it. So he's easy to mock in that way. And he's also easy to mock because they are so horrible defensively. They are such a one end of the court program. And they have been for his entire tenure. But all that aside, he's made the tournament 70% of the time the last 10 years. At a program like Iowa, which, if they're playing it clean, is not an easy place to win. Now, they had, they were from the late 70s until, say, the early to mid 90s. Iowa had a pretty good, 18-year-ish run under Lute Olson, who was a cheater, under George Raveling, who was a cheater, and under Dr. Tom Davis, who kind of let cheating happen. I don't know if he was as active.
Bruce Pearl, his assistant, was the cheater, right? Yeah.
Yeah, he was. So after that, it was, basically 10, 15 years in the wilderness until, Steve Alford had really a shockingly underwhelming tenure there, given the hype when they hired him. Todd Licklider was an abject disaster. Mm-hmm. And then Fran came in and stabilized things and then made them better. I would say for what Iowa is inherently in terms of its recruiting territory, the way they support the sport, all of those factors, tradition, I would say Fran has them in a reasonably good spot. 7 out of 10 years in NCAA tournament appearance is pretty good for what they are. And I think to get beyond that, either lightning's going to have to strike or he's going to have to go through a John Beilein late career conversion and just go hire an assistant to hand him the defense and say, make us competitive because I can't do it. That's what it would take.
It reminds me of our conversation, I think our second conversation with Mike Garland when we were talking post-game after the Iowa game. And one interesting thing he stated was that part of the reason Iowa's defense is so bad is because of the way they play offense, if you recall. So, so in some ways, you know, that they take so many bad shots and that they put themselves, expose themselves
easy offense for the other team.
To difficulty defending well. And so, and I would say there are times I'm surprised how bad Iowa's defensive ratings are, because I'm like, you know, in the half court, they're not terrible, but it's because they get exposed so often and allow easy buckets that their defensive rating becomes so low.
Transition defense has never been good in general, and that's exacerbated by exactly what Coach Garland was talking about, that, you know, you take a particularly bad shot and not only are you missing it, but because of what happens in the aftermath, it gets the opponent into an easy basket situation for them. And it happens frequently. And, you know, last year, maybe more than most, it's such a weird team because Iowa frequently under McCaffrey has actually been a good shooting team, you know, and they're not just, you kind of have a vague impression of them as a 3-point bombing thing, but that's not fair. He's actually had a lot of years where the Garza years, for example, where they went into the post and they played effectively inside too. There have been, more often than not, Iowa shoots the ball pretty well. This last year they didn't, but it really didn't matter because they don't turn it over and they offensive rebound. They get a lot of second shots. So they just have way more opportunities to score than the opponent. So even if they're not shooting it particularly well, they're still an efficient offensive team. But that defense was just horrendous. And it's hard to overcome that totally. You can do what he's done for the most part, which is win enough games with great offense to get to the tournament, but you're not going far, likely, and they never do. I don't even think he's made a second weekend at Iowa. I'm pretty sure he doesn't have any Sweet 16.
Yeah, I can't remember when they played Tennessee. So, I think that was to get to the Sweet 16 when they lost Tennessee a couple years ago.
Yeah. So, you know, it's been tough in that respect. But again, is that something? I mean, you're closer to Iowa than I am in terms of following it. I mean, do you sense that there's any dissatisfaction
I don't,
with McCaffrey?
I mean, look, I think Iowa is first and foremost a football school, which I know people find kind of funny because Iowa's not great at football. They're pretty good, but that's what people care about most in Iowa. Basketball is very much an afterthought. It's not like it is at Michigan State where you could almost argue it's like 50-50 or some you know, close combination. So, you know, as long as the basketball team is making the tournament occasionally, I think people are content. There will be a point where
and that's my impression.
Yeah, and there will be a point where that will no longer be okay. We're like, okay, now it's time to take a step forward. But they were down for so long, and we talked to those before. Just like with Tom Davis, was pretty much run out of town because he was missing recruits and because he wasn't able to win the Big Ten. And so that's where Steve Alford came in, and you know they made those moves.
Yeah,
but it takes a while to get to that point.
Changed.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. There's a reset.
That's my impression. So I think when you look at heading into this year, we got the third year running now that they've lost an all Big Ten player who led them in scoring. This time, as you mentioned, it was Chris Murray. You look at it on paper, you say, well, this looks a little bit more challenging for him to find the right formula. But I would say there's still solid offensive potential. And my bottom line is, if I've learned anything, it's in recent years, it's don't count Fran out because from at least finding a way to make them competitive, because it looked like a similar situation last year and they still got it together enough. So, and I think this team on paper, you have to look at it and say, could they be about as good this year? Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. Well, it could be a little bit like Wisconsin, where they're easy to overestimate or underestimate.
That's it.
Right?
They're a lesser Wisconsin.
Yeah.
A Wisconsin without Big Ten title contention potential.
Exactly. Yeah. All right. So you can't see this because I have the video, you know, Rod can't, but I am wearing my Iowa basketball t-shirt in honor for my wife since she's big.
Yeah.
So, this is the kind of shirt you're not going to find Nudge Printing. Nudge Printing sells Michigan State stuff. They also sell Michigan, other Michigan schools, Alma, Albion, and Central, Western, Eastern. And actually, their shirts are far more comfortable than this T-shirt, but I had to wear this for the effect. This really gets Rod fired up. So, but head on over to Nudge Printing. You won't regret it. High quality screen printed material. They are the official sponsor for the show. For apparel, you can buy our stuff at thefinalfoursontheschedule.com/merchandise for either our logoed T-shirt or hoodie. But you can get a huge selection of other things there. There's so much there. You can't go wrong, really, even if you want non-apparel like decals and things like that. And there's some other schools outside of the state of Michigan too, like Texas State and some others too. So if you want to get some cool stuff, head on over to Nudge Printing at nudgeprinting.com. 20% off for listeners of the show. They enter in Final Four into the coupon code. All right, so let's talk about some players departing for Iowa. First and foremost, of course, is Chris Murray, 6'8" twin of Keegan, who went to the NBA the year before. So he was supposed to fill in for Keegan, and for the most part did. I think he was like a lesser version of Keegan, but he did pretty well for the Hawkeyes. He's averaged a little over 20 points a game, rebounded a little less than 8 rebounds a game, shot 48, 34, and 73, which is a little bit unimpressive as three-point shooting, considering how much better he shot the year before. Of course, he didn't shoot as much with Keegan, and so with increased volume, I think it did not help him much. And so he went to the NBA. He's also got picked in the first round. He's headed to Portland. So, I mean, obviously he's going to be missed. He's a huge part for his length and athleticism in a team that kind of certainly lacks athleticism. He brought some of that, which they they need.
Yeah. It's really amazing to go back three years, and the Murray twins were both, I believe they were each sub 150 rated recruits. So there were actually Iowa fans who criticized giving them scholarships, because I remember talking about it here. I had read the criticisms.
Nepotism.
That they, absolutely. Because their father was an all-time Iowa great, that's why they were given scholarships. Well, give it up to Fran, because both of these guys ended up as first-round draft picks. Chris going to Portland in last summer's draft after his junior year, by the way, didn't even need all 4 years. They're going to miss him because he was a 3-level scorer. Maybe a little less efficient with the deep shot as his volume went up, but still good enough to be a threat. Mm-hmm. And almost 8 rebounds a game. I mean, this is a guy who really, really contributed, even with the 3-point shooting being a little bit down. But overall, look, 20 points, 8 rebounds a game. You can't complain about that production, and that's a lot to have to replace. So that's a big hole for Fran to deal with.
Well, speaking of holes, Connor McCaffrey, 6'5" guard, obviously son of Coach Fran McCaffrey. He's finally gone. He averaged 6.5 points a game, 4.1 rebounds a game, started 22 games this season, 117 assists to just 30 turnovers. So he's, fantastic assist to turnover ratio. Shot much better his last year, 38, 33, and 88, which is a vast improvement over where he began as a freshman. But, he just wasn't consistent enough from outside to really be someone you had to always worry about. And, Connor McCaffrey, I think he will, we talked about he's, I think, a fiery guy. I know he is a fiery guy. He kept it under wraps most of the time on the court, but I think that was definitely, I think he could help motivate his team and get him moving. So they'll miss that. I think that edge that he provided for the team. So that will be also lost, besides the fact that he's just a safe ball handler, right? He just fits the profile for Iowa basketball.
Yeah, and there are upsides and downsides to that. I think the upside is for an Iowa offense that clearly prioritizes not making mistakes. Yes, big positive. I think the downside is when you have too many guys like that, you lack dynamism.
Yeah.
And, Connor McCaffrey was never going to be a guy to really create for others. I would talk about him as his assists are mostly of he happened to pass to a guy that hit a shot variety, as opposed to, wow, he made a play for someone. He created a shot opportunity for someone. That's okay. That's not really a knock. It's more descriptive, because there are a lot of guys like that. Mm-hmm. And if that guy for your team doesn't make mistakes and plays that way, well, that's great. You can use that. as a shooter, he's good enough to be a credible threat, not enough to be a major positive. I think the negatives would be the lack of dynamism, and then obviously the defensive end. Just not ever a good defender. That wasn't going to change. So, it's a loss. I don't think it has to be a huge loss.
Yeah. No, I think that sums it up pretty well for Connor.
Yeah.
So next would be Philip Rambracha, 6'10" center. He was a transfer the previous year from North Dakota. I think it was North Dakota State. But he was very good. I mean, he averaged 14.1 points a game and 7.5 rebounds a game. So second in the team for both of those behind Chris Murray out there. Sorry, I almost said Keegan. And he was really pretty. I thought he was pretty good defensively too. Not terrible. Shot 57% from the floor. He's the kind of guy who knew exactly who he was and didn't try and do more than he could and played hard. And I think it was very positive for them. And part of the reason I think they were so successful losing Garza, I think losing Garza, there was a huge hole there, and he managed to fill it.
Yeah, much more so last year than his first year.
Mm-hmm.
I thought it took, and he was okay. He wasn't terrible the first year, but I think it took him a year, kind of akin to
like Tyson
Walker at Michigan State, where it took him a year, and that doesn't mean he was terrible, but it just took him a year to really get used to the level and kind of find his footing firmly. And then the second year he took off. I thought he was one of the most improved players in the Big Ten last year. In addition to all the things you mentioned, he averaged almost 1 block per game, and he had more assists than turnovers, which is a rarity for a center. He was just a very skilled guy. The only thing he didn't really bring you offensively is he wasn't much of a jump shooter. But around the basket, in the lane, very effective, very crafty, and played within himself. Again, didn't make a lot of mistakes. He actually could make plays for others out of the post. So, that's a real void, losing him. They've got some options, but I think when you look at his production last year, he's a guy nobody talked about because of the number of good bigs in the league, but he was really effective for them.
Yeah, he'll definitely be the biggest. I think he's the hardest piece for them to replace for sure going into next season. Next to departing players, Aaron Eulis, we've already talked about, 6'3" guard, averaging 6.1 points a game at 40, 32, and 71 shooting. Better than 2-to-1 assist to turnover ratio. He just torched Michigan State in East Lansing, which is like his best game of the season. He transferred to Nebraska, but of course, as we mentioned before, all kinds of gambling issues. And I guess the question would be whether he's suspended forever or just next year with the NCAA.
Yeah. It's an open question. Yeah. I think at a minimum he's looking at a year. So really the loss really doesn't matter because they weren't going to have him anyway.
Right.
I think is where you look at it now. When it happened, when he announced the transfer, it didn't make a lot of sense to me. I said, well, he was a starter. He was probably likely to at least play big minutes again. Why would he leave? But to go to another Big Ten school, and not one where you could say it was a clear step up. But I think we know now that it might have been likely was motivated by his legal situation, which we just didn't know about at the time the transfer was announced.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm almost certain, you probably could never prove this, but my guess is that McCaffrey and the athletic department knew about him and the others who are going to be swept up in this investigation. And they said, just so you know, you're not going to be on the team next year. And so this might be a good time to try and transfer and get out of here. And it's sort of like they bamboozled these other teams into taking these players. I mean, we'll see, I guess, how it all shakes. We may never know, but that's just my hunch. But either way, he's off the team, and he's something they probably could have used this year, but he's always frustrated my wife, who's a huge Hawkeye fan. So she's not happy to see him go. Finally, for departing players, Josh Ogundele, 6'11", big guy. He had showed some skills at times, but just never, I don't know, didn't seem like he's in great shape. And so he's unable to see the floor a whole lot. Ended up transferring to Middle Tennessee.
Yeah, just didn't work out sometimes. And we'll continue to talk about this in the rest of the preview. I think you could look at Fran's track record and say, well, he's had some success with lightly recruited big men. He hasn't, it's one thing he hasn't really done at Iowa is break through and recruit a lot of top 50 guys, so never mind McDonald's All-Americans. And he's hit on some of them. Magundale, he just didn't hit on. And as we've talked about with several guys, when you look at where he went to in the portal, it tells a little bit of a story that he clearly transferred down, which says, at least to date, he had convinced a lot of people that he was truly a Big Ten level player.
All right, so let's talk about players returning. We'll begin with Tony Perkins, 6'4" senior guard, averaged 12.3 points a game on 44, 33, and 76 shooting. He grabbed a little over 4 rebounds a game and averaged almost 3 assists per game, but also the team in turnovers is 55. And I think I believe the way you described him last season, he's sort of the one guy who could sort of make things happen from the guard position that they didn't have on the team.
Yep.
However, he wasn't super effective at it most of the season. I mean, he occasionally would be, but not like even for and a half, just for spurts. And so, I mean, he'll definitely be the first option at the point guard this season, but where they go may somewhat depend on how well he plays. And he lacks that assist turnover ratio that you get with the other Iowa players. So it'll be interesting to see if that changes the profile of this team and their offensive efficiency.
Yeah, and they don't have Rebraca as a secondary playmaker out of the post, so a lot's going to fall on Perkins' shoulders. I agree that he's definitely a key guy, and if you look at the way he played down the stretch of his sophomore year, that was good enough to give you a tease that he maybe had the potential to be that next guy for Iowa. Last season, where they relied on him a lot more, it wasn't as good. I mean, the counting numbers are okay. 12.3 points, 4.1 rebounds, 2.8 assists. That's not terrible, but he just wasn't quite as efficient as you'd hope for. I still think the potential's there for Perkins to maybe even be an all Big Ten kind of guy. And I don't know if they need him to be quite that good, but they need him to be significantly better than he was a year ago in order for this team to really take off and exceed expectations in any way. They just need him to be a more consistent jump shooter and playmaker, frankly, to make better decisions. I think he's going to get every chance to be the starter at the point, and they're going to put the ball in his hands, and we'll see what he does with it.
Next player, 6'7" junior, Peyton Sanford. So he's a guy who's a really good outside shooter. He averaged 10.3 points a game on 40, 34, and 86. He shot better as a freshman, 37% from three, so he definitely went down. And during part of the season, I think he was over 40-some%, and then went through a real cold streak and really had trouble. Pretty good rebounder as well, as most of these players are. Just like I mentioned, Perkins had 4.1 rebounds a game, mostly offensive. Sanford also had averaged 4.1 a game. So, a guy who struggles defensively, like most Iowa players seem to, but someone who certainly brings the effort and has the outside ability to, perhaps if that gets a little better, become a real threat consistently.
Well, look, he got to 34% from three, but that required a serious hot streak late in the season to even get that high. He spent a lot of the season really struggling to find his shot. And that was after he had a reputation as an outstanding shooter in high school and shot 37% as a freshman from three. So which one's the real Peyton Sanford? I'm betting that he's a little better as a junior, and he needs to be, because Iowa needs, you look at the guys they've lost, they need to find more scoring. Sanford is another guy, along with Perkins, very natural place to turn. Good size at 6'7", helps him get good looks. It's tougher for teams defending him to contest his shot. They just need him to be more consistent.
Next player, 6'9", son of the coach, Patrick McCaffrey. Well, Patrick has had just a really rough college career, I guess you'd say. He missed his first year because of cancer, which they talk about every time he plays. And then, of course, he's younger brother for Connor McCaffrey. And last year, he finally got through the health issues, and then he came back and he had to sit out. He sat out 6 games for mental health issues, and that's sort of like all they were described as, anxiety. And so came back and averaged a little under 10 points a game, 3.5 rebounds a game on 41, 34, and 77 shooting. Can handle the ball pretty well for a guy who's 6'9". The hard thing about him is, can he mentally, I guess, stay in the game for the whole season? And then he's a guy who he always looks kind of awkward and clumsy. Maybe it's just because he just looks kind of gangly, but he does end up scoring and he's pretty skilled. So he's an easy guy to underestimate. I think that's what I always do every time I watch him play. I don't think he plays very well. And I'm like, oh, actually he had a pretty good game.
The bottom line here is, what can you count on?
Right.
From Patrick McCaffrey, because he's shown enough. He's much more talented than his older brother. He's 3 inches taller, so he can actually play inside and out. At times, he shot the ball well. At times, he's been an effective playmaker. But all his issues, the question is, they always say one of the best abilities is availability. And that is a question with Patrick McCaffrey. If he's healthy and if he's out there full time this year, I have a feeling he'll be productive for them. And he's capable of doing much more even than he's done to date at Iowa, I believe. If you told me that he ended up putting up a season where he averaged, say, 14 points, 15 points a game, chipped in with, 5 rebounds a night, made plays for other people, I could find that believable. But he's got to be available.
Yeah, and so the one thing, I guess, for Michigan State fans, don't worry, there's another McCaffrey boy coming along the pike, and he apparently is the best of the 3 boys.
Yeah, but what's interesting is I've seen stuff suggesting that, and I don't know whether this will be borne out to be true in the end, but I've seen stuff suggesting that his intention right now is to not play at Iowa.
No. Well, he might not want to play for his dad. Yeah, who knows what they're...
We'll see. Yeah, I've read that.
Well, next player returning is Desante Bowen, 6'2" sophomore, played 26 games. He may drive my wife crazier than Aaron Eulis. He averaged 3.1 points a game on 47, 36, and 68 shooting, but turned the ball over a lot. So he's a guy who had really struggled hanging onto the ball, and that's why it made him a reserve and why it drove my wife crazy.
I think the whole key with Bowen, and look, if they get him reined in, he'd give them an element they don't often have. But I said the same thing for whatever it was, 2 or 3 years with Joe Toussaint.
Yeah.
And, it ended in a transfer out. The whole key, but Bowen's done some things well. I mean, he done some things better than Toussaint did, namely shooting the ball. He already shot it decently last year. The whole problem is to play at Iowa a lot. It's kind of like saying at Michigan State, well, this guy does some great things on offense, but he can't guard anybody. Well, he's not going to play that much. At Iowa, I think if you can't, as a point guard, minimize your mistakes, your role's probably going to be capped. And I think that's the whole deal with Bowen. Can he improve his efficiency as a ball handler or decision maker? If he can, he could potentially move Perkins off the ball a lot. But he's got to prove that he's ready to play more efficiently.
Well, and in his defense, he's now going to be entering his sophomore year, so those things can get cleaned up too.
Yeah, so, it could still happen.
Yeah, he might be. Okay.
I think this is a big year in that respect.
Correct.
You see, with a full off season in the program, what did he learn from that, and are you seeing signs of progress? And that'll tell the story.
So the next player is 6'5" sophomore, skinny Israel Josh Dix. He averaged 2 points a game on 40, and 67 shooting, and played about 9 minutes a game. So he's the kind of guy who sort of looks, I guess, like that stereotypical Hawkeye who just shoots the threes. He had 28 assists, just 11 turnovers. Couldn't play defense, but then, he's at Iowa.
I was surprised that his counting numbers, that he only averaged 9 minutes and 2 points a game, because it seemed like every time, and this was more the case later in the year where I think he was playing more. But it seemed like every time I watched them play, it felt like he was doing something.
Yeah.
But, and he did shoot the ball very well, but it's limited volume. Otherwise, though, this guy checks 28 assists to 11 turnovers, 40% from 3. He's 6'5". He checks every Fran box there is. It's easy to see why they offered him. I got to believe he's in line for an expanded role on the wing with this team, though, with the personnel losses they had, either as a starter or a key reserve. I would think his minutes are going way up.
And I will say, for as much as a lot of Michigan State fans kind of crab about the weird substitution patterns that sometimes Izzo has throughout the season. Spend about some time watching 5 or 6 Iowa games and try and make any sense of how the Iowa works their bench. It is totally bizarre. The way they have the combinations they have on the floor, they don't make any sense half the time. So if you think Michigan State irritates you, just watch Iowa basketball for a while. That's why, like, you won't. It never makes any sense what's going on and how they. I don't know if they predetermine how many minutes to get. I don't know. It's really weird. Final returning player, Riley Mulvey, 6'11", 250-pound sophomore. He basically came into spot duty just to play at the 5. So it's hard to know if he's going to do a whole lot more. He didn't seem particularly skilled the few times I saw him play, but of course he was a freshman and a big guy.
Yeah, I think, what you can say is he's in line to maybe play a little bit of a role off the bench, but they've added a lot of size to this roster. And so Mulvey's going to have to hold off some people to even get, spot duty role in the paint.
All right, well, let's talk about the newcomers right after we talk briefly about the brothers at Just Two Gutters. Those guys take care of all your water problems that you have on your roof, on your business, or your home. We all have gutters because we all deal with rain here in Michigan. If you live on the west side of the state, Grand Rapids area, out to the lakeshore, or on the east side of the state, in the entire Metro Detroit area, the brothers at Just Two Gutters have you covered. They can repair, replace, or clean. They can take care of everything. They do a fantastic job. They're very efficient, fully insured, and they get things done at pretty much any weather. They fixed my gutters in February, which I didn't think it was even possible, but they were out there in like sleet taking care of things. Did a great job and got all my gutters fixed, and now I don't have the problems I used to have. So I'd highly recommend them. Give Kurt a call if you're on the west side of the state. Give Greg a call if you're on the east side of the state. You can mention Final Four to get 10% off your order. You can find contact information below in your podcast player, or if you check things out, you can go to the website at thefinalfoursontheschedule.com and just find the episode, and you can find the contact information there. So as we talk about the newcomers for the Iowa Hawkeyes, big addition through the portal is Ben Krikke. He's a 6'9", 230-pound player who's averaged almost 20 points a game and 6 rebounds a game for Valpo. Shot 55, 28, and 80 on the season, averaging 2.2 assists per game and a block per game. So he's obviously the replacement for Philip Rambracha. Very skilled guy, very good player at the Missouri Valley. So we're seeing this a lot. There are a lot of these kind of, seems like the best players in Missouri Valley this year. A lot of them have moved to the Big Ten.
Yeah, and he's critical. They need him to give them maybe not everything Rambracha did, but a lot of it. And it looks to me like he's got the potential to do that. I mean, the numbers at Valpo are impressive. More than 19 points, 6 boards a game, very efficient around the rim, very efficient at the line, decent playmaker out of the post. It looks like about as good a replacement for Rambracha as you were going to be able to realistically find in the portal. Mm-hmm. So, he shoots the 3 more than Rambracha did, but 28% from 3 doesn't inspire a lot of confidence that you want him turning that loose very often. So it seems to me if you can get him to be primarily a post-scoring option, use his passing skills to help create opportunities for others and to rebound, that would be plenty. And I think there's a reasonable chance they can get efficient play out of him.
I watched some Missouri Valley last season, but I don't think I ever saw Valpo play. They're a pretty bad team, so I didn't see them play much.
Yeah, they've struggled since they moved up from the Horizon.
Next player is Evan Bronze, 6'9", 240-pound transfer from Belmont, but he's originally from Iowa City, so it makes sense that he comes back to Hawkeye Nation. He averaged 7 points a game on 5.3 rebounds a game, shot 58% from the floor and 69% from the line.
Yeah, and this is a guy, those numbers aren't earth-shaking at Belmont, which is a good program, but, obviously a significantly lower level than the Big Ten. I think you get a guy like Bronze to play a role. He's pretty much exclusively an interior player. So you're not looking at him to stretch the floor, but you want him in there to give you experience, some depth, some physical presence, get you an occasional bucket around the rim, grab an occasional rebound. use his body to take up space in the paint on defense. And that's really all you need. So I would anticipate this is why I think it's going to be tough for Mulvey
Yeah.
to play a lot because I think Bronze makes more sense as your backup at the 5.
Next is a new freshman, top 100 recruit, 6'7", Price Sanford, obviously younger brother of Peyton Sanford. So he is supposed to be better than Peyton as far as ability to use the ball and to shoot. So they're obviously excited to have him come into Iowa City. If he's got anything, if he's even close to as good as Peyton, he'll get some time for sure this season.
Yeah, I think he's in line. I'd be kind of surprised if he doesn't earn a starting spot opposite his brother. And you pointed out the areas that are of difference between the two and why Price is seen as a better prospect. He's also a good deep shooter, but where they separate a little bit is Price supposedly much better off the ball or off the dribble with the ball in his hands. So he may be that he may give them that kind of dynamism that they lacked last year. And the dynamism that they had was largely in the hands of Chris Murray, so that's gone. So they need it to come from some other places. I think Tony Perkins can give them some of that, but Price Sanford would be, if he lives up to his billing, would be another possible direction that could come from.
It is interesting. There are just a lot of brothers that have been in Iowa recently. McCaffrey, the Murrays, and now the Sanford brothers.
Yep.
Next player, 6'9", 230-pound, big man, Laje Dembele. He's a recruit that Fran went after, and again, to your point, Mulvey having trouble getting on the floor. This is another person who might be a little trouble to jump by Mulvey.
Yeah, you just don't know. I mean, Fran takes, he takes some of these lower echelon, lightly recruited guys, and he's turned them into impact players often enough that I think at least early in their career, you really don't know which guy. Somebody's probably going to evolve, but you don't know who. Right now, as I look at it, I think Dembele is on the outside looking in for consistent minutes, but we'll see what he develops into.
And the next two players are both from Moline, Illinois. So for those of you who want a great trivia question to go to the bar, it's Moline is one of the Quad cities. The other 3 cities, you know what they are, don't you, Rod?
Is Davenport one of them?
That's one of them. Those are the easy ones. This is a good trivia question.
Yeah. I don't know.
It's Rock Island, and then Bettendorf, Iowa is the other one. So those are 2.
Okay.
I had a kid in med school was from Bettendorf. Anyway, little useless trivia you get to learn here. All right, so next is Owen Freeman, 6'9", 220-pounder, more of a power forward than a center, and so they're hoping he can stretch the floor a little bit.
Yeah, he was a guy who MSU actually offered, although when the Xavier Booker thing really took off, I don't think that was a committable offer. But MSU was interested in him. So he's got a nice combination of size and skill. And, you look at his offer list, he wasn't a top 100 guy, but MSU had an offer. Illinois, Indiana, Marquette, Ohio State, Purdue, Northwestern, Wisconsin. So that says most of the Big Ten, or a lot of the Big Ten, at least half of it, was very interested in. So that tells you something. That's not true of every Iowa recruit.
Right.
I suspect, right now, assuming availability, I would say Patrick McCaffrey is likely your 4-man at Iowa. But I think Freeman is in line to play a role if he's as good as advertised. So, they like him as a shooter. Obviously, his size means he may be able to do some damage around the rim. And he's a good enough athlete, they think he might actually be a little better defender than what they're used to rolling out there at the post spot. So an intriguing player, and one that I think, along with Price Sanford, has a real shot to play as a freshman.
And finally, for newcomers, 6-foot point guard Brock Harding from Illinois, like I mentioned, Moline. He was a teammate both in high school and AAU of Freeman.
Yep. This is a Fran special. So not heavily recruited, not highly ranked, but you look at him and boy, we've seen a lot of guys like this under Fran. Less athletic, 6 feet tall, so not very big, but he's reportedly very skilled, guy who can shoot. He can move the ball without making a ton of mistakes. So I think what it comes down to me, is a couple things. One, is Perkins good enough at the point that they say, okay, we could start Tony here?
Mm-hmm.
So that's one thing that will impact on Harding. Then the other thing is, how much has Bowen learned? If Bowen has settled in and is less mistake prone, well, he gives you more athletically than someone like Harding does. So he's probably ahead of him in the pecking order. But if he hasn't figured that out, somebody like Harding, assuming his high school profile translates and he's able to shoot well and he's able to not make mistakes, we've seen Fran embrace these kind of guys. I
Right.
mean, his son was significantly bigger, but his son, Jordan Bohannon,
Mm-hmm.
um, although this guy was more highly regarded, Mike Gessel, going back a few years, you know, there have been a number of these kinds of guys. You don't have to be. I mean, honestly, not that I'm glad he came to Michigan State for the time he did, but somebody like Foster Lawyer probably could have played a lot for Fran,
Yeah.
you know, and so Brock Harding is kind of in that vein. So a guy like him, that in other programs you might look at and say, boy, it's going to be tough for that guy to get on the floor. You don't conclude that too quickly at Iowa. So we'll see with Harding.
Well, if you stumbled upon the show and you like what you're hearing, make sure you subscribe if you're not yet subscribed to the podcast. That way you don't miss a single episode. You can also check out our website, thefinalfoursontheschedule.com. There you can sign up to be on our email list so you don't miss exciting games we have. One of the contests we're having this season is the Beat Rod, where he's predicting teams, the Big Ten teams' final standings 1 through 14. You can do the same and try and beat him and win free nudge printing stuff. So you can send that in to Eric, E-R-I-C, at tffinots.com. And make sure you just put in your name and also how many points you think Michigan State will score against Michigan this season. And remember, they play them twice. That will be our tiebreaker, which we had to use last year to separate some winners. So again, 1 through 14 on how the teams will finish. And we use the Big Ten tournament seeding because that's the only way to really do it reasonably. All right, so overall for this team, I don't know. It's kind of hard to guess because again, they look depleted, but then you see potential, right, in this lineup, and you kind of know you have a history with Fran McCaffrey, and it's not like the cupboard's entirely bare, right? He has parts that were working well last season, so you would assume that they're going to be competitive, they're going to be a pest, they're going to beat you at times, but they're also going to disappoint you if you're an Iowa fan a number of times as well.
Well, I think, look, there's a number of levels you look at this. So the first thing is, what do you got coming back? And they've got some guys who've done some things, but those guys need to elevate their performances significantly. So Perkins and Peyton Sandfort
Mm-hmm.
have to be more consistent. They just have to be. As shooters, is first and foremost. They've just got to be better than they were. Patrick McCaffrey, his son, has to be available. If he's able to play all the time, they'll get good production out of him. But I like the odds of at least a lot of that coming to pass, and to some level, because history, this is where Fran's track record comes in. History tells us this is kind of what he does. Guys get better over time, offensively at least, at Iowa. And so I don't think it's a stretch to imagine that Perkins will find another level of consistency, that Sandfort will have his shot dialed in from the start of the year instead of, halfway to 2/3 through. Patrick McCaffrey's a little more of a wild card just because his issues have just been unrelenting his whole career. But if he's able to stay in there full time, they'll get something useful out of him. So I like the odds of that happening. Then the next step is, what do they get out of the newcomers? Well, they need Cricky to be really good.
Mm-hmm.
And that doesn't mean 20-10, but they need him. They need him to be a bona fide Big Ten center that can play the way Fran needs him to play, meaning he'll run some offense through him. He's effective on the boards, and he's efficient around the rim, giving them a low post presence. I think that the two guys they've added in the post in the transfer portal have the potential to be good answers. Price Sandfort kind of has to live up to his billing, which doesn't mean superstar, but it means a guy who is capable of stepping in and playing a big role, maybe even starting immediately and giving them real offensive production. And then, you look at Freeman and Harding, and you're not certain what you'll get out of those guys, but boy, they both seem to fit that Fran profile of very skilled offensive players. And so it's not crazy to think, yeah, those guys could be helpful. So I think most of putting them here is based on Fran's track record of being able to get enough offensive improvement and efficient offensive play out of whoever he's rolling out there. And I think that's not a crazy bet to make. And then after that, it just comes down to how effective are the newcomers. And I'm inclined to believe they'll get enough out of those guys. Krikke, having done it in the Missouri Valley, is helpful. We've already talked about one Missouri Valley player at Nebraska who's a big man. Krikke actually was more productive in that same league. Mm-hmm. And so I think there's reason to be optimistic that he's going to be pretty good at center. And if he is, and those returning guys I mentioned are, find that next level up, I think saying Iowa's a tournament team again is not a stretch. They're in the mix. I'm giving them an edge over some of these other teams based in large part on Fran's track record. That's not 100% certainty to hold, but if I got to make a choice, that's why I'm making that choice.
Sure. And if you look at the teams that you've had picked a little bit behind them, there are actually even more questions there. I think it's I think totally reasonable where you have them. And then I don't know. I mean, I think again, we're splitting hairs a lot of times here. And when you were ranking coaches early this summer, I think you had McCaffrey, as much as we kind of tease it, joke about him, as the third best coach in the league, because they're just of the track record. A lot of the coaches have.
Did I have him there?
I think so.
Did I have him third?
I think so. I have to go back, but I'm pretty sure that's where it was, because it was sort of like,
okay,
Shrewsbury would have been there, but he left, and it's like there's Izzo and Painter, and then there's kind of like everybody else, right?
Yep. As I think about it now, I mean, I'm sure I had a good rationale at the time, and the more I think about it, but I think if I remember correctly, I think I must have said something like, yeah, at first blush, I would have said no way. But as I thought about it, I thought, yeah, it probably is a defensible pick, because the rest of these guys have holes too.
Yeah. I mean, if you think there aren't, there's Guard and Collins and, Holtman and Peichel and, and the guys, Rhodes, who hasn't played, had yet, Underwood, Howard. I mean, you go through the list and there's not anyone who jumps out like, oh, what are you, crazy? So, I mean, you got to have someone who's got to be third. Yeah. So anyway, and certainly Fran.
Yeah, I don't think this is the year that Fran has his big breakthrough and wins a Big Ten, or, goes on a run to the Sweet 16 or the Elite Eight in the tournament. I don't see it as that kind of team, but as a team that has a legitimate shot to get back to the tournament, yeah, I'd go that far.
Right. Well, and maybe one of these years you get the right matchups in the tournament, you can go a little ways too, which would be kind of nice for the Big Ten to get a couple of those teams that surprise people. All right. Well, until next time, the Final Four is on the schedule. Go Green.